Hello, my name is Sean Osborne, and welcome to the Black Patriots of Lexington. Lexington, Massachusetts, the birthplace of liberty, the site of the first armed conflict of the American Revolution. Lexington, the home of black residents since it was known as Cambridge Farms. Some of those black residents owned property and paid taxes. Others were enslaved or indentured. Many of them played vital roles in the founding of the United States of America. On today's episode, we'll be talking about the life and times of Caesar and John Ferrit. Changing it up a little bit, Caesar and John were Natick residents, but on April 19, 1775, they ended up firing on the retreating British regulars as they were passing through Lexington Green. Joining me today is Dr. Zine Magubane. Professor, how are you?
Hi. Nice to be here.
So, one of the reasons why it's important to have you here, not just because of your background as a professor at BC in sociology, but also because you're a Natick resident.
I do. Very proud resident of Natick.
So, when you think about Natick history, had you ever heard of Caesar and John Ferrit?
I had not. I mean, Natick, it's an old town, established in 1651, but it's really much more known as what was called a praying Indian town, established by John Eliot, who was known as the apostle to the Indians. He translated the Bible into Algonquin, and he set up these towns of what were called converted Native Americans, many of whom arrive at towns like this after having suffered disease, blight, broken communities, etc. It kind of offered both a refuge from, communities that have been quite distressed, and as well part of this general sort of Christianizing mission. John Eliot was a preacher, and that was really what Natick was known for. I did not know anything about Caesar Ferrit.
So it's interesting because Natick, like so many communities, are proud of their Revolutionary War history, and you have 6+ Negro soldiers from Natick, 2 of whom fired on the Green on April 19th, and yet you look around Natick for signs. It's just like looking around so many other communities across Massachusetts, finding a record of a black soldier for public consumption, especially from that period, is hard to find.
Very hard to find, and the way people hold categories very strict in their mind, they would have probably emphasized the Native American part of his ancestry, as opposed to the fact that he, as a self-described, a man of 4 nations. So it's possible that when children are taught about Caesar, they're more or less taught about, him as a Native American of mixed ancestry, rather than, as we see him, a person who started his life in the West Indies.
Right, so we have heard the records that he was in the West Indies, no island of record per se, and then that he ends up in Boston as a coachman. And so you mentioned that he's a man of many nations. I remember one is, I think he called it Native Caribbean, and then another was African, and then what were the other 2?
French and Dutch.
And those were his grandfathers.
Right.
Right. Grandfathers, French and Dutch. Right. So, given your knowledge of that time period, how do you think the French and the Dutch and, well, let's go easier, the Native American, or the Native Caribbean? My understanding is that there weren't a lot of Native Caribbeans left.
Right.
So how would a Native American woman have ended up in the Caribbean in the late 1600s, early 1700s?
Right. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there. There was, depending upon where you were in the West Indies, like there were indigenous persons, of Native ancestry who would have been indigenous there. That could have been his ancestry. But also there was something called the Indians for Africans trade, whereby Native Americans who were prisoners of war elsewhere were sent to the West Indies in exchange for enslaved Africans who came here. the idea that it was easy to control people when they're not on their home turf. So it was really about removing Native Americans who were familiar with the area and selling them into slavery somewhere else. That also could have been part of why he had Native ancestry.
Wasn't that one of the consequences of the King Philip's War?
Exactly, exactly. Many of those people were sold it to the West Indies. So that also could have been why he had Native ancestry.
And then for the African ancestry, where were the Africans in the Caribbean? Where were they likely to come from, and who would have brought them?
I mean, he could have been in Haiti, called Saint-Domingue, which would have meant that they would have had large numbers of ancestors that came from Angola, the Congo region. That would have made perfect sense. If he was in one of the English islands, then he could have had relatives that came from the Senegambia region. I mean, and then as well, the Dutch, they had Fort Nassau, which was in West Africa. But also the Dutch were known as the people who moved commodities all, that's how they made their money, moving them all throughout the Atlantic. So he could have been from any number of places on the African continent.
And then as a child with mulatto parents, because it was grandparents talking about, so both parents are mulatto,
Yeah.
what would have been the impetus to move him from that island to New England, Rhode Island, or Massachusetts?
Right. I mean, he would have been known as a Creole, which was a person who was born in the Caribbean, right? So they posed a threat, really. I mean, for people who are arriving, so if a place like what's now known as Haiti, I mean, they were bringing in people of African descent. The expected lifespan was 3 years. They'd work you to death. But you were also highly unfamiliar with the place. There were a lot of rebellions, but a different sort of rebellion as someone, for all we knew, he could have spoken French, he could have spoken English, he could have spoken Dutch. He had been born in the colony. So a person like that had all the makings of a slave revolt leader, actually, right? He was before Toussaint's time, but yeah, I mean, that would have been the very type of a person who would have been positioned to revolt against his circumstance.
So those enslaved children who were then brought to New England, which families would purchase a child?
A well-off family, because it would have been a while before he could have been strong enough to really do the kind of work that would have brought in profit on a farm, heavy farming, working with animals, things like that. So if a little kid, 7, 8, 9, I mean, it was a family of some means because he was a dependent at that time.
So would that, if that was the case, would that have given him the social graces to be a coachman in Boston as he was?
Exactly. So I mentioned Toussaint Louverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution. Interestingly, he was also a coachman. A coachman was an elite job. As well, a coachman had mobility, which is a valuable commodity during that time, right? You're dressing up the horses, you're taking your master everywhere, which means you have some freedom of movement, certain types of refinement. You're also in the position to overhear all kinds of conversations. So it was not only a plum position, but it was a position that produced more than one revolutionary.
Okay, all right then. So at some point he meets his wife. There's a story that's most popular, I think was very fanciful, about his wife choosing love over means. So do you know that story?
So the story is that there was a fairly well-off white woman who was engaged to marry someone else, and she fell for him and, disowned by the family and all of the things, but she went for love and overlooked the color line.
I see you smiling.
It's possible.
Okay, love is true. So the other story I have heard about her is the potential that she could have been a native woman from the Cape Cod who had found her way after leaving her church in Cape Cod into Boston. You were talking about praying Indians. Was that also something that's going on in Cape Cod as well?
Yes, definitely. I mean, during this time, in the 1700s, Native Americans had been under a considerable amount of pressure from colonial forces, right? There were communities in great distress, which is an amazing, spur to conversion, right? Your community that you have had is no longer there. What is available? The church offers some sort of refuge, of course, in exchange for conversion, and a number of those people were also indentured, right? I mean, Native Americans were also held in bondage. We mustn't forget that. So especially young Native children were particularly vulnerable, women. So there were quite a lot of Native American people working in conditions of forced labor.
And so once a Native American who had joined the community through the church and part of the parish, what were the protections they would get from that relationship?
Any number. There was a reason that Eliot converted the Bible into Algonquin, which was literacy, right? That would have been one thing. Another thing would have been access to steady employment in indenture, or what everybody wanted was their own patch of ground in order to farm, raise their own subsistence first and foremost, and then what was left over, sell at market. But the number one thing is you needed that piece of ground.
So you had a choice then as a Native American, and at that time period, you could either convert and have access to land, or not convert and not be allowed to have land, or how'd that work?
I mean, it really depended because you had communities at various states of conquest. So,
Okay.
I mean, there are still nations that are, viable and basically fighting to hang on to the ground, but they're under considerable amount of pressure from the Puritans, from the colonialists, right? So there were people who were still part of communities that were in active resistance, but there are also communities that are rapidly succumbing as they're losing these wars, and their options, the range of options then narrows, right? In sense of my own community now is not in the condition where I can reasonably expect to be supported, right? I must find some other way of keeping myself alive.
And so Dr. Lorenzo Green, in his book, The Negro in Colonial New England, talks about during colonial time period that there were a lot of Native American communities that had Negro fathers.
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how that came about?
I mean, again, it was a time where there not only are still some independent Native communities, but if people were going to escape from slavery, one refuge was to try to integrate into some sort of a Native family, right? I would also say that those marriages that happened between, African men and Native women, I mean, they certainly were a feature of colonial life, right? You might had, given how things were, more likely to be able to make a marriage with a Native American woman. And again, those days marriage was for love, but it was also, the family was a unit of production. You needed to have a wife in order to have a homestead, right? Getting married was not just, like today on Match, I want to find my soulmate, but the family was the unit of production.
So that might explain why someone like Aaron Burr's brother, who had an enslaved man who fought Revolutionary War, afterwards he ends up marrying a Native American widow.
Exactly. A wife, children, a homestead.
Okay. Great. So Caesar Ferrit and his wife are married. They leave Boston. They go out to Milton. They have a farm, right? So this goes back to the idea of family, children, a means to raise everyone. They had many children. In 1753, they petitioned the Master General Court to move to Natick, to be amongst his people. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He says he wants to live amongst his people. To go back to what might have been in his mind at that time, again, it might have been about a community where he could, because we're not sure what happened to the farm he had, right? A foothold, right? In order to, again, community means access to a piece of ground, whether alone or the ability to find yourself a situation where at the end of whatever service that you've rendered, you get a piece of ground. I think in his mind, it was, how do I establish myself as an insider, right? So I do think that making that claim, and then if you go fast forward to the end of his life, where he's quite destitute, he's able to get what we might today call something like a pension. I mean, it wasn't that word, but basically it's written, he's old and destitute, but we are going to give him a little something, and he claims to be a member of, you know, the Native community.
So does he have to, he's petitioning to move in the Natick as opposed to just purchasing the land directly. Is that because of the way the praying community worked?
I imagine it must have been, right? I mean, I know that when John Eliot established the towns, right, it's not like people, Native American initially ran there very eagerly, right? So he had all of these different arrangements that he had. Like he would say to people, if you'll send one or two of your children, I'll give you something, a coat, a Bible, etc. I mean, he had to entice people. So I imagine there was some sort of architecture that was set up that for people who joined that they got something. So that petition tells you that there was some sort of a certification or some sort of a, it wasn't just a free-for-all that you came and rocked up and declared yourself. He clearly sought that certification because once he had it, he was going to be able to get something that people who did not have that recognized status did not get. And again, since he wasn't born into the community, that's why he went through that process.
Okay. And so, fast forward to 1775. He is part of the Natick Militia, along with his son, John Ferrit, who is in his early 20s. And John is, I believe, the youngest son. And they respond to the Lexington Alarm. In the records show, I believe, that the town of Natick supplies several members of the militia with muskets, including Caesar. What do you think is going through his head with his son? He's now he's at least in his 40s, if not older, as they are responding to that alarm, going from Natick to Concord and then eventually to Lexington.
That's an interesting one. Well, he was one that was getting paid for his service.
They both were getting paid.
They both getting paid. Yes. So again, that could have been a real motivator. Why they, enlisted, joined up, etc. And again, in terms of community membership, standing, etc., as a person of his station, it would have been expected. So I think what you see along Caesar's life is a continual attempt buying that farm in, what was it, Medford or? Milton, right? You see a person continually striving for adult male membership, right? Wife, homestead.
And he understands, as you said, as a coachman, he's able to overhear from those who are doing well in society how things work. So he understands how to petition, what to say in the petitions. Exactly. He seems to be successful in doing that. And do you think that's part of why he's able to make his way through life until he gets to 75?
Yes, absolutely. He would have been privy to a lot of conversations. Also, a lot of conversations about what's happening in terms of their own colonial overlords. So a lot of discussions about we want to shake off these shackles of the British. You know, he would have overheard a lot of conversations, and he would have had a notion of the type of gentleman that he wanted to be.
And so I appreciate you saying the gentleman he wanted to be, and I think of him as it's rare to have, especially on April 19th, to have a father-son combination. So you have two free black people coming to Lexington Center, and as the British regulars are retreating from Concord, they fire on them, and then they take cover. And then they were able to share that experience with their comrades from Natick. And that story is proudly shared until today. So is that part of one of the consequences, the positive consequences of responding to the alarm for the ferrets?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. You know, having participated in this search for freedom, which also had all sorts of connotations about what we might call like masculine achievement, right? Like he's gone with his son, they have established themselves, they have participated in this event, the trading of the stories, and again, in these communities that are small and run on what type of social capital have you built up with your friends, with your neighbors, etc. I think all of that is in his mind as, I feel like Caesar is a person that does not fall into things.
He's planning.
He's a person who thinks about things, right? Has strategies, and he knows the strategies of successful people in his community.
So he continues to enlist for a few more years, and he's in his service. And he also has another son who enlists. So they have three ferrets who are veterans. At the same time, we have Thomas Nichols, who appears to have been, if not freeborn at the time, he's a free black man who the year before, in 1774, was arrested and was being held in Concord on April 19, 1775. What can you tell us about Thomas Nichols?
He had been arrested for enticement, which is not something I had, up until reading about that case, heard of a black man accused of. It was a very common charge leveled, especially like in colonial Virginia. Any place that ran on indentured servitude, there were never enough servants. Once an indentured servant would arrive, there would be basically a scramble for maybe the one that I'd ventured to me has died, disappeared, etc. Basically to say, I know so-and-so has promised you X. If you come with me, I'll give you something more. Where in the back of your mind you're thinking, I'm really hoping this person is dead before the end of their indenture, but basically this crime of enticement. And again, the legal architecture was not robust like what we're used to. So you found yourself, maybe you've paid a servant's passage, and all of a sudden they've been enticed right out from underneath you. You go to the colonial burgess, but it could take forever, and you might not ever get any restitution. All that to say is, when I knew about this charge of enticement being leveled at landowners in colonial Virginia, that was the first case I'd heard of a black man who had that type of a charge. But clearly, he was also trying to entice servants. And they said servants and slaves.
Right, so he's trying to entice them away, which interestingly, that is what the Caldwells were accused of in the Quock Walker case.
Exactly.
Is that they were trying to entice him away from his enslaver. And so, but this case in his arrest goes to Connecticut and it gets published there. given what you know about Virginia, it seemed, do you think enticement was a rare or an important enough potentiality that thus it became this news event at the time?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this, again, labor is the heart and soul of survival in a colonial society. Nobody can run a farm on their own, right? Hence why the family is this important unit of production.
Okay.
But families are at various stages. You might have very young children. You might have a very large homestead. You need labor. Again, unlike the South, which eventually ends up in a situation where they're growing cotton, sugar, tobacco with, large pools of gang labor, the New England was a different situation. It was largely family farms, right? So they would not only have a smaller number of slaves, but it tended to be there were exit pathways out of slavery, in the sense of to hold a slave for life was also a very, very expensive proposition, right? We always think about slavery as the slave master's doing great. They have all these people working for them for free, which is true. But you are also, it is a lifelong commitment. You have to maintain your slave, which even Southern slave owners were terribly in debt. All that to say is, in terms of these types of family farms, being able to secure a person's labor for a portion of time was often what made most financial sense, right? Not to actually hold someone enslaved for life, but to have somebody guarantee you labor for a period of time in exchange for payment, land, etc. In that situation, enticement becomes a real threat, right? The laborer is in somewhat of an advantageous situation in that circumstance, where you might find someone who feels like, I really do need more hands. This person is an excellent worker. Might I be able to entice them away by promising them more, promising them a shorter indenture?
But Thomas Nichols doesn't appear to have the means to pay. So is he enticing them away from enslavement to employment? Is he enticing them away from particular families? I mean, it's sort of broad in the category.
If he had some sort of land or something like that, I mean, it could have been the enticement then. I don't have much now, but if you come and you work for me and we build something, at the end, I'll cut you off a little bit of something.
So it's not, there's not enough information to think of Thomas Nichols as an abolitionist as much as because it's about enticement is a crime. It's what it's called.
Yeah,
right?
and they say servants and slaves, interestingly. So he was accused, at least as it was written, of not only having tried to entice in some indentured servants, but also some enslaved people. Where you think about that, the idea of being able to not be a slave anymore would have been an attractive proposition. So even if he didn't have a lot to offer, you can see from the person who is being enticed, their motivation.
And whether you're indentured or you're enslaved, you're still calling the person who's the head of the household master and his wife mistress.
Probably. But given that he was of less means,
But with the people he's enticing.
Oh, the person is, yes, absolutely.
Right. So in that case, they are trying to get freedom from their master.
Absolutely.
And so I found it ironic that there's someone in jail in Concord for enticing people away from their masters, whether they were indentured or enslaved, while colonists were engaged in fighting the British regulars for trying to leave what they believed to be their master-slave relationship with the King of Britain.
Ironic, isn't it?
It is ironic. And I always think about what does that mean for the Ferrit family with their discussion in 77, 78 after Thomas Nichols is found innocent because there's not enough to convict him.
Not enough evidence.
Right.
Well, I suppose you'd have to think where the evidence would come from. So perhaps they asked the enticed, to which the enticed said, didn't happen. So, and again, when we think about why is community so important in colonial New England? Those sorts of situations, these court cases that come up, right? Who are the witnesses that are called, etc. Those type of community ties are exactly what people are thinking about all of the time. Because maybe there was enough evidence, just nobody would supply it.
Right, and so you have these different branches of the same tree. You have Caesar Ferrit and John Ferrit fighting for freedom in one way. And then you have Thomas Nichols fighting for freedom in a different way. Yet they're all family.
Yeah, I mean, again, even in terms of when you think about this, I'm really just kind of stuck on this idea of enticement. Again, in these colonial communities, another reason why there might not have been enough evidence is the charge might have been leveled by a bitter, angry neighbor, jealous neighbor, etc. Right? Community operated in ways that are similar to how we live today, but also quite different. And that kind of accusation leveled by a neighbor was quite a common thing in those times.
And so, what I'm hearing about the Ferrit family is that you have free black people who are concerned with building relationships and building community. And for John and Caesar, part of that was through being members of the Natick Militia and responding to the Lexington Alarm. And that Thomas Nichols is a sidelight to their story, but would probably not be the key feature in their mind on that day as they are traveling to Concord and then Lexington.
We imagine not.
But for me, that's the as you think about the black experience in colonial American Revolutionary War, is that neither father or son-in-law saw the world the same way.
Exactly.
They had different experiences. And so when you think about going back to Natick and celebrating the Ferrits even more so than they are now, what do you think the people in Natick should know, or in Lexington should know?
Sure. Well, I think what definitely they should know, one, that Natick has been diverse from the beginning, right? That Natick has this very interesting and rich sort of tapestry of a history that, literally scans what this sociologist Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. And he's always stressing the idea that, the Atlantic Ocean is like a bridge, and we have to think about black people moving as soldiers, as sailors, as enslaved person, as indentured people. This notion of a constant movement and movement of people doing very different kinds of things. Kind of get away from this static image that we have from movies like 12 Years a Slave, and Django Unchained. I mean, they all have their place. But, there's also this incredibly rich history that we have in New England that I think bears much more telling than it has.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
I hope that you are inspired to learn more about the Black Patriots of Lexington and the other Black Patriots of the Revolutionary War. These men and women were heroes and founders of our great nation, the United States of America. Till next time, I'm Sean Osborne, and thank you to the researchers and curators who make this program possible, and to ABCL, the Community Endowment of Lexington, LexMedia, and Tricon's The Red Tails.